Emma Ridgway's fingers danced across the keypad of her register, muscle memory guiding each motion as she counted down her drawer for the evening. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar sterile glow across the red and white landscape of Target store number 2187. At 9:45 p.m., only stragglers remained. A mother hurriedly grabbing diapers, a college student debating between ramen flavors. 15 minutes to closing, the overhead speaker crackled, Juan's voice echoing through the nearly empty aisles. Emma tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, noting how the evening shadows stretched longer than usual across the polished floors. Strange, she thought, how different the store felt after sunset. Like a stage after the audience had left, waiting for a different kind of performance to begin. She shouldered her cleaning cart, metal wheels squeaking against the floor as she began her final rounds. The beauty section first, then electronics, following the same pattern she'd walked for the past 2 years. The motion-activated lights flickered to life as she passed, each section brightening, then dimming in her wake. Tonight, though, the darkness that pooled in the corners seemed thicker, more tangible, as if it were slowly seeping inward from the edges of her vision. The first flicker came from aisle 7, home decor. Emma paused mid-stride, watching as the fluorescent tube sputtered like a dying firefly. She'd have to note it in the maintenance log, though something about the irregular pattern made her pulse quicken. 3 short flashes, a pause, then 2 long ones, almost like a signal. "Juan," she called out, her voice bouncing off walls lined with throw pillows and decorative mirrors. No response. The store's usual ambient hum felt different now. Underlying it was a subtle discord, like a symphony playing slightly out of tune. Emma pushed her cart forward, its squeaking wheels now seeming inappropriately loud in the emptiness. A child's laugh echoed from somewhere near the toy section, causing her to freeze. It wasn't the usual happy giggle of a kid eyeing the latest action figure. This sound carried a hollow quality, as if it were traveling through water. But the last family had left 20 minutes ago. She'd watched them go herself. The security camera's red lights blinked steadily above, but their presence offered little comfort. Each time she glanced at them, they seemed to be facing a slightly different direction than before. The sensation of being watched crept along her spine, invisible fingers trailing up each vertebra. A box of cereal tumbled from its shelf in the grocery section, the sound sharp and sudden against the store's unnatural quiet. Emma's flashlight beam cut through the dimness, revealing nothing but the fallen box. As she bent to retrieve it, her light caught something in the reflective surface of the freezer doors. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong somehow, standing at the end of the aisle. She whirled around, heart hammering against her ribs, but the space behind her was empty. The overhead lights flickered again, this time in a cascade effect that traveled the length of the store. In those split-second intervals of darkness, the familiar aisles seemed to stretch and distort, like a funhouse mirror's reflection. The temperature dropped noticeably, her breath now visible in small, frightened puffs. The scent of artificial pine cleaner gave way to something older, mustier, like wet earth and decay. Her walkie-talkie crackled to life, Juan's voice breaking through the static. "Emma, you okay? You've been standing in the same spot for..." The rest of his message dissolved into white noise, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like whispers. Multiple voices, speaking words she couldn't quite make out, but understood she wasn't meant to hear. Emma's trembling fingers pressed the walkie-talkie button repeatedly, but only bursts of static answered her calls. The shadows at the edges of the aisles had begun to move in ways that defied physics, stretching, twisting, reaching. Her flashlight beam seemed to bend around them, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. The mannequins in the clothing department had always unsettled her, but now their blank faces seemed to track her movements. One's head was tilted at an impossible angle, its plastic features twisted into what could almost be a smile. As she backed away, she could have sworn its fingers twitched. "We're closing now," a voice announced over the intercom, but it wasn't Juan's familiar tone. This voice was thin and reedy, with an echo that shouldn't have been possible through the store's speakers. It repeated the phrase, each iteration becoming more distorted until the words were barely recognizable, dissolving into a sound like nails on chalkboard. Movement caught her eye, a shopping cart rolling silently across her path, pushed by invisible hands. The wheels didn't make a sound against the floor, but the child's seat held something that made her blood run cold. A small, wet handprint that seemed to materialize as she watched. The electronics section erupted into life behind her, dozens of display TVs flickering on simultaneously. Each screen showed the same image, security footage of the store, but not from tonight. The timestamps jumped erratically, showing snippets of days, weeks, years past. And in each frame, standing in different aisles, was a dark figure staring directly at the camera. Staring at her. "Just stay calm," Emma whispered to herself, but her voice sounded wrong in the thick air. She tried to make her way to the front entrance, but the aisles seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. The bright exit signs that had always been her North Star now appeared in impossible places, reflected in mirrors, floating midair, multiplying until they formed a dizzying maze of red glows. A child's ball bounced past her feet, following an unnatural trajectory that defied gravity. It was followed by the sound of running footsteps, but they came from above, tiny feet pattering across the ceiling. The temperature continued to plummet, frost crystallizing on the shelves around her. Her breath came out in terrified clouds as she spotted them. Dark figures standing at the end of every aisle she turned down, their forms somehow darker than the shadows surrounding them. The lights above began to pop, one by one, each small explosion sending a shower of sparks raining down. In the strobe-like effect that followed, Emma caught glimpses of faces in the darkness, pale, distorted things with eyes that reflected light like animals. They seemed to be drawing closer with each flicker, their movements jerky and unnatural, like footage from a broken film reel. A display of glass jars shattered spontaneously beside her, forcing her to stumble backward into a shelf of stuffed animals. The plush toys began to vibrate, their electronic components activating without batteries, filling the air with a cacophony of distorted lullabies and children's laughter. Through their noise, she heard something else, a voice, clear as day, whispering her name from just behind her left ear. Emma's trembling hands fumbled with her phone, fingers slipping on the screen as she tried to dial 911. The display showed full signal bars, but each call dropped immediately, replaced by a high-pitched tone that made her teeth ache. When she finally managed to open her messages, the screen filled with corrupted characters, transforming into what looked like countless tiny screaming faces. A crash from the grocery section sent her stumbling backward. The sound of glass jars shattering against tile flooring created a horrifying symphony, followed by the wet slap of their contents hitting the ground. The scent of marinara sauce filled the air, but underneath it was something metallic and organic, like blood. "Hello," a voice called out. Juan's voice, but something was wrong with it. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Emma, where are you? I can see you." The voice distorted, dropping several octaves until it became an inhuman growl. The store's automatic doors at the entrance began opening and closing rapidly, their mechanical whirring growing faster and more aggressive. Emma ran toward them, hope flaring in her chest, but each time she got close, they slammed shut with enough force to shake the frame. Through the glass, she could see the parking lot, but it wasn't right. The cars were from decades past, their forms shifting and melting like wax under a flame. The customer service phone started ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the chaos. Emma watched in horror, as the handset lifted itself from the cradle, hovering in midair. Static crackled from the speaker, forming words, "Welcome to Target. How may we help you today?" The voice was computerized, but held an undercurrent of malice that made her skin crawl. A shopping cart shot past her like a missile, crashing into a display of electronics with explosive force. Tablets and smartphones rained down, their screens lighting up with impossible images, security footage showing events that hadn't happened yet. Emma saw herself running through the aisles, pursued by shapes that shouldn't exist in any natural world. The store's speaker system erupted with noise, fragments of announcements, music, and conversations all playing simultaneously. Through the cacophony, she could make out snippets that chilled her to her core. Clean up on aisle 13, blood spill, code 0. They're all dead. Emma, why did you come back? The temperature continued to drop until her breath crystallized in front of her face. Frost patterns spread across the floor like living things, forming symbols that seemed to writhe and change when she tried to focus on them. The ceiling lights began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, each flash revealing more shadows gathering at the edges of her vision. A mannequin crashed to the floor behind her, its plastic limbs contorting into impossible angles as it dragged itself forward. Its blank face began to crack, revealing something underneath that moved and pulsed. Emma ran, her footsteps echoing off the walls. But the sound that came back wasn't her own. It was the patter of dozens of feet, running in perfect unison. The store's security shutters began descending without warning, their metal sheets slamming down with devastating finality. Each crash felt like a countdown, sealing off another possible escape route. The last shutter fell just as Emma reached it, missing her fingers by inches. She was trapped now, enclosed in a maze of aisles that seemed to be actively reshaping themselves, guided by some malevolent intelligence that knew exactly where she was trying to go. Through the gaps in the shelving, she caught glimpses of movement, dark figures that matched her pace perfectly, always staying just out of direct sight. They seemed to be hurting her, driving her deeper into the store's heart, where the shadows grew thicker and the air itself felt heavy with malicious intent. The employee break room door creaked open on its own, beckoning Emma inside with an unnatural draft. As she entered, the ancient computer in the corner hummed to life, its screen flickering through years of archived security footage. The timestamp read November 13th, 1987, exactly 35 years ago to the day. The grainy footage showed a different Target store layout, but unmistakably the same location. Old newspaper clippings materialized on the break room table, appearing as if pushed up through the surface by invisible hands. The headline screamed in bold type, "Tragic fire claims 13 lives at local Target," and questions remain about mysterious department store deaths. The papers were yellow with age, but the ink looked fresh, glistening wetly in the flickering fluorescent light. The security footage continued playing, showing a group of late-night employees, their uniforms different but familiar, closing up the store. Then the screen erupted in flames, the timestamp jumping erratically. Through the chaos, Emma could make out dark figures moving against the fire's glow, their movements too fluid to be human. The employees on screen were running, screaming silently through the video feed, as something pursued them through the aisles. A child's drawing fluttered down from the ceiling, crude crayon figures depicted in red and black. It showed stick figures surrounded by flames, and in the corner, a dark shape with too many limbs. The artist's name was scrawled at the bottom, Sarah Mills, age 8. Emma recognized the name from the newspaper's list of victims. The break room lockers began to rattle, each metal door shuttering in sequence until reaching the last one, marked with faded tape bearing the name Marcus. It burst open, spilling out a security uniform from decades past, still reeking of smoke. A badge clattered to the floor, its surface blackened except for a single clear handprint. The computer screen shifted to a different camera angle, showing the store's back room. Emma watched in horror as the footage revealed the truth. The fire hadn't been an accident. A figure in a security uniform was locking doors, trapping the others inside. But something else was there too. Something that had been waiting in the shadows. Something that had taken advantage of the guards' malicious actions to break through into their world. Old invoice papers swirled around the room like leaves in a storm, their text changing as they moved. Stock numbers transformed into desperate pleas for help. Inventory lists became accounts of the horror that unfolded that night. The walls themselves seemed to weep, dark liquid seeping between the tiles, spelling out words. They invited us in. You gave us 13 souls. Now we need more. A name badge skittered across the floor like a living thing, coming to rest at Emma's feet. The photo showed a face she recognized. Older, but unmistakably Juan's father, Marcus Rivera, the security guard who had supposedly died trying to save the others. But the footage told a different story, one of betrayal and dark ritual, of a man who had made a terrible bargain with something that lurked in the spaces between reality. The temperature in the break room plummeted as the truth revealed itself through fragments of the past. The fire had been a sacrifice. 13 souls offered to entities that had been waiting, watching from the shadows of the store since its foundation was first laid. But the sacrifice had been incomplete. One intended victim had escaped, breaking the ritual. Now, 35 years later, the entities were trying to complete what they had started. The lights flickered violently as realization struck Emma. She wasn't randomly chosen to work the closing shift tonight. Her grandmother had been the one who escaped in 1987, and now the shadows had drawn her descendant back, seeking to close a circle that had been left open for 3.5 decades. The shadows converged on the break room, seeping under the door like black smoke. Emma clutched her grandmother's locket, the one she always wore during shifts, the one that had survived the fire 35 years ago. It burned hot against her skin, glowing with a faint blue light that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. A figure materialized from the writhing shadows. Marcus Rivera, or what remained of him. His security uniform still smoldered, flesh blackened and cracked like cooling lava. Behind him, 12 dark shapes took form, each one a twisted echo of the souls sacrificed that night. But they weren't victims anymore. They had become something else, something hungry. The circle must be completed. Marcus's voice grated like grinding glass. Your grandmother's escape denied us our full power. But you're here now, blood of her blood. The entities moved in perfect synchronization, herding Emma toward the center of the store. The floor beneath her feet began to crack, revealing ancient symbols carved into the foundation. Emma's mind raced, remembering her grandmother's stories, not the sanitized version she told the newspapers, but the real account, whispered late at night. The ritual could only be completed willingly. That's why her grandmother had survived. She hadn't given consent, hadn't surrendered her soul to the darkness. The sprinkler system suddenly activated, but instead of water, it rained fire, drops of flame that bounced and spread across the floor. The shadows danced in the infernal light, their forms becoming more solid, more horrifyingly real. Emma felt their hunger, their desperate need to complete what had been started decades ago. Your grandmother fought us with light, Marcus snarled, his form flickering between human and something incomprehensibly other. But we've learned. We've grown stronger in the dark. The fluorescent lights exploded overhead, showering the scene with sparks and glass. But Emma's locket blazed brighter, its light forming a protective circle around her. The entities launched their assault, claws of shadow raking against her barrier of light. Each impact sent shockwaves through her body, but the locket's glow held firm. Emma remembered her grandmother's words. Light is truth, and truth is their weakness. Understanding blazed, through her mind like lightning. She began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. She named them, each victim of that night, not as they were now, but as they had been. Sarah Mills, the 8-year-old who loved to draw. James Chun, the college student working part-time. Maria Gonzalez, the young mother of 3. With each name, the corresponding shadow creature shrieked and recoiled. Marcus's form began to unravel at the edges, his confidence fracturing. You can't stop this. The price must be paid. But Emma saw through him now, saw the scared man who had made a terrible choice, who had been promised power but received only eternal torment. The locket's chain snapped suddenly, the pendant falling to the floor. As Emma dove for it, the shadows surged forward. But instead of grabbing the locket, she snatched up a piece of broken mirror. She held it up, forcing Marcus to confront his true reflection. Not the powerful being he imagined himself to be, but a hollow shell consumed by guilt and darkness. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and Marcus screamed, a sound of recognition and horror. The other entities began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart as the truth of their existence was exposed. They weren't demons or gods. They were reflections of human fear and regret, given power only by belief and darkness. Emma raised her grandmother's locket one final time, its light now pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. I reject you, she declared, her voice ringing with authority. This circle will never be completed. The light exploded outward, and with it came dawn's first rays streaming through the store's windows. The shadows screamed in defiance, but they were already fading, their power breaking like a fever in the morning light. The morning sun streamed through Target's front windows, transforming the store back into its familiar self. Emma stood in aisle 13, her grandmother's locket clutched tightly in her trembling hands, its metal still warm to the touch. Around her, the store hummed with normal early morning sounds, the gentle whir of refrigeration units, the distant beep of delivery trucks backing up to the loading dock. The first early shift workers found her there, surrounded by inexplicable debris, shattered glass, scattered papers, and the lingering scent of smoke that seemed to fade with each passing moment. Their concerned voices and questions washed over her like distant waves. But Emma's eyes remained fixed on the subtle shadows that still lurked in the corners, now powerless but not quite gone. She watched as the morning crew swept up the physical evidence of the night's horrors, none of them noticing the faint symbols that still glowed beneath the freshly waxed floors, or the way certain security cameras now pointed permanently at the ground, their lenses cracked and darkened. The mannequins had returned to their proper poses, though Emma swore she could see finger-shaped scorch marks on their plastic skin. As she finally walked out into the parking lot, the rising sun warm on her face, Emma felt the weight of generations shifting. She understood now why her grandmother had always insisted on leaving a light on at night, why she'd passed down a locket that seemed to glow from within. The store behind her cast its morning shadow, shorter now, ordinary, but she knew better. In the space between fluorescent lights and darkness, between commerce and corruption, ancient hungers still waited. Her resignation letter would be on her manager's desk within the hour, but she kept her grandmother's locket. Some battles, she realized, weren't meant to end in a single night. Some shadows needed constant watching, and some stories needed to be preserved, if only to warn those who might one day find themselves closing up shop when the lights begin to flicker.